Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, my precious pack, and welcome back once more to VEGA Conflict, the game that sucks your soul out. What I want to talk about today is the Comandante carrier, but before I start talking about it, I want to show you all something that I tested to check and see the moment I got it out of the ship factory. Let's go ahead and let's go take on a planetary target real quick, so I can show you what I mean. So, before you ask, just watch. Pay attention to the carrier's active ability, the bolster. I wanted to test to see if it could be activated via the spawn ships. And yes, it can. That's a good thing. It's a good thing because it means that we can use a certain tactic with it. Carrier kiting, if anyone's old enough to remember that from the older days of VEGA, carrier kiting was a tactic that could be used, and simply put, a very effective way of using a carrier because most other things would be outranged by it. Let's head back to base real quick. Okay, so what I mean by that is you literally run away and you win. It only works against NPCs because players would be able to counter it because they would just be able to use their heads. But the reason I wanted to show you that and the fact that it activates via the spawn ships being classified as allied vessels within its support range is it means you basically at Mark IV Plus will always be able to have active 4 Phantoms, and you'll always have active your bolster stance. You'll be able to run away very easily. And the higher levels you get and the faster it moves, as well as anything you put on it, such as harmonic chase thrusters, it's only going to make it faster. It's going to make it more efficient in what it does. It's not efficient as it is now, though, because I've been listening to people and watching people, and they're having issues with it in mixing it in with fleets. It's just not as viable for most fleet combinations. PvE, switches is dominant for a reason. This isn't going to be very compatible with a switch fleet because to begin with, it'll be faster than the switches. And likewise, once they activate their overdrives, their prime shifts, they'll be faster than it, so it won't be able to keep up. So it's not viable with them. Is it viable with breakers? No, because they're too fast. They'll leave it behind and it won't be able to do its support role. Deadeye, well, I don't even use Deadeyes because I just don't like them. It was a poorly designed ship in my eyes, and I don't use them. And if I show my actual build sequences and whatnot, that'll also prove what I think of it, because I only have one. And I'm not planning on building any more because I just don't like it. It's just not a good ship. So, back to the general thing. What I want to suggest is 2 things. A behavioral change and an inclusion of an ability on the vessel. Because first off, by all intents and purposes, it can work alone. It can't do that right now because it's locked behind a certain barrier that we have to kind of push aside and get the dev team to deal with. Squadrons in their own are a useless throwaway item in the game at this point because of the lack of durability. Even with the carrier in Prime Shift and with the bonuses active towards the bottom of the increased health, they're still not very viable just because they take a single hit and they take an extremely large amount of damage and it cripples their damage output. And because all of them are stacked on one another, when one gets hit, they all get hit and they all get negatively affected like that. So the first thing I'd like to actually suggest is to stagger the launches. And what I mean by this is for every one slot we have active that is hanger-wise, this affects all carriers. This is a general change, not even just specifically to affect the Comandante. It's for all of them. In the case of any type of squadron weapon, delay the launch. So have it so slot 1 launches instantly because it's always prepared and ready to launch. Slot 2 will launch half a second after that. Slot 3 will launch half a second after that one. You get the general idea. Each one launches half a second after the previous. And the reason for this is because every weapon in the game has a firing cycle and a reload cycle. You want to be able to exploit that. So in most situations, a half second or a 1/4 second delay between the launches will allow the first one to take the blunt of the hit, possibly be destroyed. The second one to take a little bit of damage if it follows the same flight path, but the third, fourth, and fifth to approach the target safely. And the reason for all of this is just to allow it to be viable alone, because again, mixing with other fleets or other ships, it just doesn't really work out because the ships themselves they struggle with it. So when you use it with, say, switches, it's just not a compatible ship, and it's all because of how it's designed. by all intents and purposes, they tried to make it a support ship, but that just didn't work out because, again, fleet compatibility issues. Alone, though, it looks like it'll be decent for farming if we can push them to unlock it. Second change to actually make it viable alone is a bypass inclusion. And this is going to be either through mark upgrades or starting a Mark 1 going to Elite. And it's either going to have a 25% or a 30%, depending on which path you choose and which path we push for. The reason for this is because it's such an incompatible ship with everything else that we use that it's a bit of a liability. And we don't want that. We want to be viable. We want to be able to use it. However, by all intents and purposes, they designed a ship that is to be used actively by a player rather than farm it with the AI, because the AI just trashes this thing, which is a shame because it's not that bad. Well, I say that even though I'm pretty sure that in any of my previous recordings I would have called it trash. And by all intents and purposes it is right now because of how it's designed and how it has its behavior hasn't been updated. No carrier's behavior has been updated. And it's time for that to change. But at Elite, it would be able to benefit from its spawn, so it would have the increased mobility. That is basically like having an entire fleet of harmonics with it right there. Mix that with the high damage drones with decent amounts of health, especially at level 3. Mix that with the staggered launch and shield bypass. They should be able to pick apart most targets by kiting them. And yes, I am suggesting bringing carrier kiting back this way. PvP, it won't work out too well because people already have massive fleets, and I mean, breakers would be able to excel against this thing because they'd be able to rush it all at once, and I mean, you'd be able to snipe it. It would just poof, gone, just like that. And because it only has access to explosive weapons, basically, you have basically one weapon type to use on it. So, it's easy to understand how to buff it and stuff like that, but I want to keep this video fairly short. So go ahead and let me know what all of you think of the suggestions as well as its behavior and trying to bring back carrier kiting. To summarize, what I want to do is the following. Push for the behavior changes so that it has a staggered launch instead of an all-in launch. That'll reduce the number of them to get hit to allow it to actually do damage, making it a viable damage dealer. 2, including bypass makes it a more flexible build by allowing it to fulfill the role of a damage-dealing bypass, so it could also be used to snipe specific enemy targets in a fleet. So, in a way, my changes to make it a solo ship that's actually decent are actually affecting it in a positive way for fleet use. And finally, just go ahead and share your thoughts because I want to know what you think. Do you think it would be viable or not? Because right now, it doesn't really seem to fit in any of my fleets because it's too much of an oddball. It's not fast enough in the late game with my switches, and it's too fast in the early game. So it doesn't manage to keep the pace. I don't know exactly how to describe it. It just doesn't seem to fit right. So I wanted to make it something to be used on its own. While not on par with a Dreadnought, it should at least be able to do something. But go ahead and let's start discussing it down below. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you found it a little bit more informative, because at the beginning I did include the part that I could have completely left out of just showing you that the spawn ships affect its bolster drive. So you basically get harmonics via them, which is a nice bonus. But hopefully you did enjoy, as I said. Be safe out there, my pack. Happy hunting. And as always, I'll see you later.